A cowboy is standing in a trading post in southern New Mexico territory. It's 1865, and the post smells like tobacco and old leather. Men are haggling over ammunition and flour. But in the back corner, something is happening that makes Garrett Hollis stop breathing. A man with a scarred face is holding a rope. On the other end of that rope is a girl. She's maybe 8 years old. Apache. Her dress is torn. There's dried blood on her knees. Her eyes are completely empty, the way a child's eyes look when they've stopped expecting anyone to help. The scarred man is asking for 15 horses. Nobody is offering. A few men glance over and look away. One laughs quietly. Garrett has 12 horses tied outside. They're everything he owns in the world. Every single animal he raised, broke, and trained over 7 years of ranching alone. But here's what you need to know about Garrett Hollis before this moment makes sense. 8 months ago, he buried his daughter. Her name was Ellie. She was 6. Scarlet fever took her in 4 days. Garrett dug the grave himself in the hard ground behind his cabin, and he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another human being since. He looks at the girl on the rope. She is not his daughter. She doesn't look like his daughter. She doesn't remind him of his daughter in any specific way. But something in his chest tears open like a wound that never healed, and before his mind catches up to his body, he's walking toward the scarred man.
12 horses, Garrett says.
The man frowns. I said 15. You've been standing here an hour, and nobody's offered 5. 12 horses, or you feed her yourself tonight. The scarred man looks at Garrett, then at the girl, then at the horses visible through the window. He unties the rope and holds it out. Garrett doesn't take the rope. He kneels down, pulls out his knife, and cuts it off her wrists. Then he picks her up and carries her out of the trading post. She doesn't struggle. She doesn't cry. She just goes limp in his arms, like something that's forgotten what safety feels like. Now, the trading of captives on the frontier was not rare. It was a documented and brutal practice. Rival tribes raided each of others' camps and took women and children as prisoners, sometimes to absorb into their own bands, sometimes to sell at frontier posts for horses, weapons, or supplies. The Spanish had participated in captive trading for centuries before American settlers arrived. By the 1860s, the practice had become a grim economy of its own, with certain traders specializing in moving human beings across territorial lines. This girl had been taken during a Comanche raid on a Chiricahua Apache camp. The raid had been devastating. Warriors killed, families scattered. The survivors believed the chief himself had died defending the camp. His daughter, a girl named Ayanna, was dragged away and eventually sold down a chain of traders until she ended up at the end of a rope in a New Mexico trading post. Garrett didn't know any of this. All he knew was that he had a child in his arms and 12 fewer horses than he'd had that morning. He brought her to his ranch. He gave her food. He gave her water. He showed her the small room off the kitchen and put a blanket on the bed. Then he sat on the porch outside and waited. For 3 days, Ayanna didn't speak. She ate what he left for her. She drank the water. But she wouldn't look at him, and she wouldn't leave the room. Garrett didn't push. He left the door open every morning so she could see it wasn't locked. On the 4th day, he was repairing the corral fence when he heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw Ayanna standing in the doorway, watching his horse. The animal was limping from a stone bruise, and Garrett had been trying to treat it without much success. Ayanna walked to the horse. She ran her hand along its leg, pressed her fingers against the hoof, then looked around the yard. She walked to a patch of wild plants near the creek, pulled several leaves, chewed them into a paste, and packed the paste against the horse's heel. By the next morning, the horse was walking clean. That was the first thing she taught him. Over the following weeks, Ayanna began showing Garrett things about the land he'd lived on for 7 years, but never truly seen. She knew which roots reduced swelling. She knew which berries were edible and which ones would make you sick for a week. She could read the sky and predict rain a full day before it arrived. She was 8 years old, and she knew more about the territory than any rancher Garrett had ever met. In Apache culture, children weren't passive. From a young age, girls learned plant medicine, food preparation, and the practical skills that kept families alive. Boys learned tracking and hunting. But the knowledge wasn't gendered the way settlers assumed. Girls could track. Boys could heal. The education was about survival, and survival didn't care whether you were male or female. Slowly, something began to grow in the ranch house that neither Garrett nor Ayanna had words for yet. He taught her English. She taught him Apache words for things English didn't have names for. He showed her how to saddle a horse. She showed him how to move through brush without making a sound. He told her about Ellie. She didn't tell him about her family, because the memories were still too sharp. But one night, sitting by the fire, she said one word. Father. Garrett looked at her. She wasn't talking about her Apache father. She was looking directly at him. He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. That's right. A year passed, then another. Ayanna grew taller. Her English became fluent. She could ride better than any boy in the territory. She tracked deer for Garrett with a skill that made experienced hunters shake their heads in disbelief. One afternoon, she tracked a missing calf across 2 miles of bare rock by reading marks in the stone that Garrett couldn't see even when she pointed at them. Apache tracking techniques could follow trails across surfaces that appeared completely blank to untrained eyes, using displaced dust, slight soil compression, and the faint directional bruising left on pebbles. But Ayanna also changed Garrett. The man who hadn't spoken 10 words to another person for 8 months was now reading stories aloud at night, laughing when Ayanna corrected his attempts at Apache pronunciation, and building a second chair for the kitchen table because the first one was too small for her growing frame. If you're watching this story and it's hitting you the way it hit me, subscribe now, because what comes next is the part I wasn't ready for. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Ayanna was gathering herbs by the creek when she froze. Garrett saw her from the corral. Her body went rigid the way a deer freezes before it bolts. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She was staring at the eastern ridgeline. Garrett followed her gaze. Against the morning sun, he counted 8 silhouettes on horseback. They sat motionless on the ridge, looking down at the ranch. Apache. Garrett's hand moved to his rifle. Ayanna grabbed his wrist. "No." The riders descended slowly. As they drew closer, Garrett could see they were Chiricahua, warriors in their prime, armed. But their weapons were not raised. The lead rider was older than the others, with deep lines in his face and a bearing that radiated authority. Ayanna made a sound Garrett had never heard from her, a sound between a gasp and a cry. She stepped forward. Then she ran. She ran directly to the lead rider and threw her arms around his leg before he'd even dismounted. The man's face, which had been carved from stone, cracked. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He slid off the horse and held his daughter so tightly, It looked like he was trying to absorb her back into his body. Ayana's father was alive. Chief Nantan had survived the Comanche raid, though he'd been left for dead with wounds that took months to heal. He'd spent 2 years searching for his daughter. Every camp, every trading post, every rumor. 2 years of believing she might be dead and refusing to accept it. And now he was standing in a white man's yard, holding his child, and looking at Garrett Hollis with an expression that could have meant anything. One of the warriors spoke in rapid Apache. Another pointed at Garrett. A third drew his knife halfway from its sheath. Nantan raised his hand. Silence. He spoke in Apache. The translator, a younger warrior, turned to Garrett. The chief wants to know why his daughter is here. He wants to know what you did to her. Garrett felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he'd built with Ayana over 2 years was about to be interpreted through the lens of a father who believed his child had been stolen. I bought her, Garrett said. The words sounded wrong the moment they left his mouth. The warriors' faces hardened. The translator spoke again, and Nantan's eyes went dark. I bought her to free her, Garrett said quickly. A trader had her on a rope at a trading post. I traded every horse I had to cut her loose. I never tied her up. I never locked a door. She's been free to leave since the day I brought her here. Nantan listened to the translation. His expression didn't change. He looked at Garrett for a long time. Then he looked at Ayana. He spoke to her in Apache. The conversation lasted several minutes. Garrett couldn't follow it. He watched Ayana's face shift through emotions he couldn't read. She pointed at the ranch house. She pointed at the horse whose hoof she'd healed. She pointed at Garrett. Then she said something that made Nantan close his eyes. The translator turned to Garrett. She says you are her father too. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Garrett had ever heard. Nantan stood very still. A father who'd spent 2 years searching for his stolen child had just been told that another man had taken his place. The warriors behind him shifted. Some looked angry. Others looked confused. Now, in Apache culture, family wasn't defined the way settlers defined it. The Apache matrilineal system meant that a child's identity came through the mother's clan. Family obligations, inheritance, and belonging all traced through the female line. But the bond between a father and daughter was sacred in its own right. Nantan hadn't just lost a child. He'd lost the person he was raising to carry their family's future. And he'd just discovered that a stranger had been doing the job he thought death had taken from him. Nantan spoke quietly to Ayana. His voice was soft, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used with his warriors. She listened. She nodded. Then she walked to Garrett and stood between the two men. He wants me to come home, she said in English. Garrett's throat tightened. I know. He's my father. I know that too. But you're also my father. Garrett knelt so he was at her eye level. Every part of him wanted to grab her, put her on a horse, and ride until nobody could find them. But he'd spent 2 years teaching this girl that strength means doing the right thing, even when it breaks you. You were never mine to keep, he said. You were always yours. Ayana's eyes filled with tears. She turned to Nantan and spoke in Apache. Whatever she said made the chief look at Garrett differently. The hardness drained from his face. Something else replaced it. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The recognition of one father looking at another. Nantan stepped forward. He placed his hand on Garrett's shoulder. Through the translator he said, "A man who gives up what he loves, to do what is right, has the heart of a warrior. My daughter says you saved her life and taught her to laugh again. For this, I carry a debt." Garrett shook his head. "No debt. She saved me too." Nantan nodded slowly. Then he did something that stunned the warriors behind him. He removed a turquoise pendant from his neck and placed it around Garrett's. In Chiricahua tradition, this was a kinship marker. It meant family. "You are welcome in my camp," Nantan said. "Not as a guest, as family." Ayana looked at Garrett. "He means it. I know he does." "Will you come visit?" Garrett managed a smile that cost him everything he had. "Try to stop me." Ayana rode away with her father that afternoon. She sat tall on the horse, looking back twice. The second time, she raised her hand. Garrett raised his. Then the riders crested the ridge and were gone. Garrett stood in the yard for a long time. The ranch felt bigger than it had any right to feel. The second chair at the kitchen table was still there. The herbs she'd planted by the creek were still growing. The horse she'd healed nickered softly from the corral, looking for the girl who'd fixed its leg with leaves and patience. He walked inside. He sat at the table. He looked at the empty chair. Then he stood up, saddled his horse, and rode east. Because a father doesn't stop being a father, just because the road gets longer. Garrett visited the Apache camp 3 times that year. Each visit, Ayana ran to meet him before he reached the perimeter. Each visit, she was taller, stronger, more fluent in the language of her birth. She was becoming the person she was always meant to be. And each visit, Nantan sat with Garrett by the fire and talked. Not about politics or territory or the wars that raged across the frontier. About children. About loss. About what it means to raise someone and then let them go. 2 fathers, 2 cultures, 1 daughter who belonged to both. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do on the frontier isn't fight. It's open his hands and let go of the thing he loves, trusting that love doesn't need a grip to hold. Now, the real history of cross-cultural families on the American frontier, the children raised between 2 worlds who grew up to shape both of them, is a story that rarely gets told. That story is on screen right now.